Can happen throughout WordPress, and using conditional statements to check when a certain action happens isn't very efficient. We would have a lot of nested code. Instead, there's something called hooks. The hooks API is a way for you to listen to an event and execute code when that event happens. An event can be anything. There are literally over 100 different hooks. There's a hook for the footer, or when an admin form is submitted. There's Ajax hooks and so much more. We won't be going over all of them because it would just be too overwhelming. If you don't understand, don't worry. You'll see how it works in just a moment. We will definitely be going over some of the most commonly used ones though. In the Resources tab of this lecture, you'll find a link to the Hooks API. Let's check this out. You'll notice that there's a list for two kinds of hooks, action hooks and filter hooks. We'll be going over both of these throughout this course. Let's take a look at the list of action hooks available. Scroll around this page. You'll see all the hooks available to us. I know we haven't gone over how to use hooks yet, but just from looking at this list, do you think you can spot the hook we need in order to add scripts and styles to our theme? Most people would say WP_head, but this is incorrect. The correct hook is the one above it, which is WP_onQ_scripts. Click on it and let's take a look at this hook. This is what WordPress has to say about it. WP_onQ_scripts is the proper hook to use when onqueuing items that are meant to appear on the front end. Despite the name, it is used for onqueuing both scripts and styles. Just by reading that, you know it is indeed the correct hook to use when adding scripts and styles. Alright, so let's get started with using action hooks. Open up your functions file and under the hooks section, add the following code. add_action, open parentheses, apostrophe, WP_onQ_scripts, apostrophe, comma, apostrophe, JU_onQ, apostrophe, close parenthesis, semicolon. The add action function is a function that WordPress automatically creates and loads for you. You don't need to do anything to make sure it's available to you. This function has 4 parameters, but only the first 2 are required. The first parameter is the name of the hook you want to access. In our case, we want to access the WP_onQ_scripts hook. Make sure you input this as a string. The second parameter is the name of the function you want to call when this hook is called. The other 2 parameters we'll be discussing in another lecture. For now, we only need the first 2. Currently, we don't have this function defined, so we'll get an error. Let's fix that quickly. As I stated before, I don't like to add all my logic and code in one file. So let's create a folder called includes. Within this folder, create another folder called front. The front folder will contain any code and logic pertaining to the front end of our site. Within this folder, create a file called onq.php. Let's create the function we called from our action hook. Great, we're almost done. Now, we need to include this file. So let's go back to the functions file and under the include section, include the onQ file. I'm using the getTemplate directory function to make sure we always get the correct path to this file. This function simply returns the absolute path to the current activated theme. Just like the add action function, you do not need to do anything to make this function available to you. It is already loaded and created for you beforehand. WordPress takes care of that for you. I'll be using this function whenever we include files. If we did everything correctly, we should be able to refresh our page without any errors. Since we have no errors, that means we did everything correctly. One last thing before I wrap up this lecture. You'll notice I named my onQ function JU_onQ. I prefixed our function with some initials. It's common practice to prefix your classes and functions with the initials of your theme or name. Throughout this course, I'll be prefixing JU_ for every function. The J is for my name Jack, and the U is for the name of this theme, Udemy. We do this because we don't want to run into any naming conflicts with other plugins. In our next lecture, we'll take a look at adding styles to our pages through this hook. Adding a script file is almost the same as adding a style sheet. However, unlike style sheets, we can load script files in the footer. If we take a look at our template, we have 2 files being loaded in the header and a few other scripts being loaded into the footer. Just like adding files inside the head tag, we also have to call a function from the footer to instruct WordPress where to load the files in the footer. At the very bottom of our template, right before the closing body tag, call the WP footer function. This function allows our theme and other plugins to load their files into the footer. Alright, now that we have that set up, let's go to our onQueue function and start adding our scripts. Just like style sheets, we have to register our scripts. In the resources section of this lecture, I provide a link to the WP register script function. Let's take a look at what WordPress has to say about this function. As you can see, only the first two parameters are required, and they're basically similar to the WP register style function. In the index template, we include a script called fastclick. Let's add this script to our head through our onQueue function. So let's call the WP register script function and pass in a handle name. The handle name will be ju_fastclick. The second parameter is the source. Just like last time, we'll be using the WP template directory URI function. Lastly, just append the actual path relative to the themes directory, which is assets, vendor, fastclick, fastclick.js. The next step is to onQueue the script. The function that allows us to do this is the WP onQueue script function. All it needs is the handle name we registered in our script earlier. So let's call it and pass it the handle name. If we did everything right, we should be able to refresh our page and see it loaded onto the page without any errors. Great. Let's also register Modernizer and onQueue it. Make sure to remove these tags from the head tag as well. Now, in most cases, you always want to load your scripts in the footer to allow our content to be loaded before our scripts. So, how do we make our scripts load in the footer? Let's go back to the WordPress codex and take a look at the WP register script function again. You'll notice that the fifth parameter determines whether or not a script is loaded in the footer. By default, it doesn't. We have to pass in a true Boolean value so that we can load scripts in the footer. So let's take a look at our index template and let's load the bootstrap file first. Bootstraps depends on jQuery, but we won't be registering jQuery, and I'll explain in a moment why. In our onQueue function, let's call the WP register script. Like before, pass it in a handle name of ju_bootstrap. Don't worry about this conflicting with the style handle name. Style and script handle names are kept separate, so there won't be any conflicting issues. Let's pass in the source, assets, scripts, bootstrap.min.js. The third parameter is this script's dependencies. In some cases, your script will depend on the functionality of another script. You have to pass in an array of handle names for WordPress to make sure those scripts are loaded first before this one. In our case, we don't have to worry about dependencies, so we'll just pass in an empty array. The fourth parameter is the version of the script. If you update your script frequently, this can be a useful parameter to set. This is because a lot of WordPress sites have cache enabled. By updating the version, you'll force WordPress to load the latest version of this script. I'm going to set this to false, as I don't really need to worry about versioning for this script. The whole point of this part of the lecture is to load the script in the footer, which is the fifth and final parameter. All you have to do is pass in true. That's it. Let's onQueue Bootstrap and see if it loads on our page. WordPress also loads its top nav bar for users who are logged in. After confirming that it loads, why don't you pause the video and load the rest of our scripts? Alright, so I basically just registered and onQueued the rest of our scripts. You'll notice that I also removed their inclusions from the footer. If I refresh our page, you'll see that everything is loaded correctly except for one thing, jQuery. We also get a couple of errors in our console saying that jQuery isn't loaded or defined. In our onQueue file, I didn't bother registering or even onQueuing it, but why? Let's go to the WordPress codex and take a look at the WP register script function. In the contents sidebar, I want you to click number 6, handles and their script paths registered by WordPress. You'll be taken to a part of the page that tells you that WordPress already registers jQuery. WordPress actually registers a large number of scripts. A lot of them are commonly used by WordPress developers, libraries like jQuery UI and underscore. If we scroll down long enough, you'll find jQuery. So all we have to do is onQueue this script before onQueuing anything else. Let's do this now. Refresh your page, and if you did everything right, then you should see any errors related to the jQuery are gone. Now, before I end this lecture, I want to say one very important thing. Never ever override WordPress's default scripts, including jQuery. There are some developers out there that like to include their own version of jQuery, which may seem great and all, but it's not really a good idea. You aren't the only developer using jQuery. If developers constantly use their own versions of scripts, this could break a client's site and cause hours of debugging. It's so much better to just use a jQuery version that's consistent throughout the site. So please don't try and override WordPress's jQuery. Let's take a look at how to add styles through our hook. It's pretty straightforward. There are only 2 steps required to add styles to our pages. The first step is to register our style. Registering styles simply means that you're telling WordPress that you have a style sheet and you would like WordPress to know its location along with other details. In the resources section of this lecture, I provide a link to learn all about registering styles. In order to register a style, use the wp_register_style function. Under the usage section, you'll see we're using this function correctly because it says, use the wp_unqueue_scripts action to call this function. Calling it outside of an action can lead to problems. Since we're already doing that, it's safe to assume we can use this function. This function has 2 required parameters. The first parameter is the handle name. The handle name can be thought of as a unique name or ID for reference. The second parameter is the source to the style sheet. Let's go back to the onQueue function and use this function. Alright, so let's call the wp_register_style function and let's pass in a handle for the first parameter. If we go back to the index template, you'll see we have 4 style sheets being loaded. The first style sheet is Bootstrap. So let's just call this handle ju_bootstrap. Just like functions, it's also common practice to prefix our handles with some initials. For the second parameter, let's pass in the source. There's actually a function that will always point to the current themes directory. This makes it easier on us as we don't have to perform checks if the owner of the site changed the names of the themes directory. This function is called get_template_directory_URI. You do not have to pass in anything and you don't have to include any files to get this function to work. This function is loaded and created for you by WordPress. You may notice this function is similarly named to the getTemplateDirectory function. The difference between these 2 functions is the URI version will actually get the web URL. The non-URI version gets the system path. The other parameters aren't really needed for our theme, so we won't be going over them. However, feel free to take a look at them and mess around with it. That's it. If we refresh our page, you'll notice that this won't work just yet. We've only registered our style. Now we must tell WordPress we would like to add it to our page. We now have to use a function called wp_unqueue_style. I've also included a link to this function in the resources section of this lecture. This function only has 1 required parameter, which is the handle name of the style we registered earlier. You'll notice the other parameters are similar to the wp_register_style function. However, these are only available just in case you forget to register a style. You should always register a style though. The difference between registering and unqueuing a file is that register will tell WordPress about a style sheet and make it available to be called later on, while unqueuing will instruct WordPress to load our style sheets onto the page. You will not always want to unqueue a style on every page as it isn't always efficient. There's also plugins out there that will sometimes scan registered styles and perform actions such as minifying or combining style sheets together. So it's best to register first, then unqueue. Let's unqueue the Bootstrap style sheet. Right after registering, let's call the function wp_unqueueStyle and pass in the handle name ju_bootstrap. Alright, we're almost done, I promise. There's only one last thing we need to do in order for all of this to work. If we go back to the index template, you'll notice we haven't told WordPress where to load our style sheets. Our template is pure HTML. Let's change that. Go to the head section of our template and right after the title tag, call the function wp_head. The wp_head function is a function defined by WordPress. This function simply tells WordPress this is the spot where themes and plugins can unqueue their style sheets and script files. Let's refresh our page and we should see some of it working. If you see something similar to what I see, then you're good to go. Let's wrap up this lecture by adding the rest of our styles. Here's what I want you to do. Pause the video and add the rest of your style sheets. Alright, so now that you're back, you should have something similar to what I have on my screen. You'll also notice that we were using two Google font sets called Roboto and Roboto Mono. Since these are hosted outside of our site, I didn't use the get template director URI function. I just pasted in the direct URL that Google provides. Lastly, I edited the index template and removed any reference to these sheets since we're doing this the WordPress way. Let's go to our home page and open up the console. You'll notice we get a lot of errors, but we'll fix these soon. What I want you to look for is any 404 errors related to style sheets. If you don't see any, then that means you loaded everything correctly. Awesome! Our site is starting to look pretty cool. Let's talk about adding scripts in the next lecture.